The fire was supposed to choose for him. It always had for 200 years, every Iron Veil Alpha bound to whichever woman made the flame leap toward the sky. But when Derek Sullivan looked into that bowl and saw the fire die instead of rise over Hollie Ellis's open palm, he didn't step back like tradition demanded. He stepped forward, broke a law older than his own bloodline, and claimed her anyway. What he didn't tell her, what he barely let himself believe, was that his ancestors had paid for choices like this one in blood, and the debt was about to come looking for both of them. If you've ever been the one nobody chose first, stay with Hollie's story to the end. Subscribe now, because what happens when tradition finally breaks is not what anyone in that hall expected. Chapter 1. The fire ceremony at Iron Veil didn't happen under open sky like the soft, sentimental matings Hollie Ellis had heard about from PAX to the south. It happened in a stone hall with no windows, where the only light came from torches and the silver ceremonial bowl at the center of the floor, and where every unmated woman in the pack stood in a single line waiting to learn whether the flame inside that bowl considered her worth anything at all. Hollie had been in Iron Veil territory for 6 days, long enough to learn the layout of the guest quarters, the names of maybe a dozen pack members, and the particular way the older wolves here looked at outsiders, not with curiosity, but with the kind of caution people reserved for storms they could see coming, but couldn't yet name. She'd come with her cousin's family, refugees in slow motion from a border dispute 2 territories over, and Iron Veil had taken them in the way packs sometimes did, when there was room and no good reason to refuse. She hadn't expected to be standing in this line. She certainly hadn't expected anyone to suggest she belonged in it. "You don't have to do this," her cousin Dorothy had told her that morning, braiding Hollie's dark hair back from her face with hands that wouldn't quite stay steady. "Guests aren't required for the ceremony." "I know," Hollie had said it to the mirror, not to Dorothy. "But if I'm going to live here, I want to understand what I'm living inside of." That had sounded braver in the bedroom than it did now, 20th in a line of 23 women, watching the fire in the silver bowl rise and fall and rise again, as Alpha Derek Sullivan walked the length of the hall and waited for it to tell him something he apparently couldn't determine on his own. The mechanism was simple, at least in theory. Each woman placed her open palm above the bowl, not touching the fire, never touching it, and the flame either leapt upward in a bright surge, a match, or stayed flat and small, indifferent, nothing. Hollie had watched it happen 11 times already, 8 in different flames, 3 surges, each one drawing a ripple of murmurs through the watching crowd, though none of the 3 had drawn Derek forward to actually claim anyone. He simply nodded at the result and moved to the next woman, his expression unreadable, his amber eyes flat with something that looked less like interest and more like obligation. He was younger than Hollie had expected an alpha to be, early 30s maybe, with the kind of build that came from actual labor rather than performative bulk, dark hair cut short and practical, a jaw that hadn't fully relaxed since the ceremony began. He didn't look bored exactly. He looked like a man doing a chore he'd done many times before, and trusted least of all of them. "Karen Hamilton," the pack elder announced, and the woman 2 places ahead of Hollie stepped forward. The fire didn't just surge, it roared, a column of orange light that threw shadows up the stone walls and drew an audible gasp from the crowd. Derek's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He inclined his head to Karen, a small, formal gesture, and said nothing else. Karen, for her part, looked less thrilled than anyone Hollie had seen surged for all night. She stepped back into the line, with her eyes down and her hands clasped tight enough that her knuckles paled. That was strange. Hollie filed it away without quite understanding why it mattered. Then it was her turn. "Hollie Ellis," the elder said, glancing at a small slate where names had been written in chalk. "Guest of the Hunt family." She stepped forward because there was nothing else to do, because 24 pairs of eyes were already on her, because running would have been its own kind of answer. She held her palm out over the bowl, the way she'd watched 20 other women do, and waited. The fire didn't surge. It didn't stay flat and indifferent either. It went out. Not flickered, not dimmed. Out, in the space of a single heartbeat, as though someone had doused it with water nobody could see. The hall went utterly silent. Even the torches along the walls seemed to dim in sympathy, though Hollie knew that had to be her imagination. "That's," the elder started, and then stopped, because there was apparently no precedent for what to say next. Hollie pulled her hand back, heat crawling up her neck that had nothing to do with the dead fire. Of course the one ceremony she'd let herself be talked into would produce the single worst possible outcome, something so far beneath indifferent that the entire hall had gone quiet trying to process it. She'd expected nothing. She'd gotten less than nothing, and from the expressions around her, pale faces, someone in the back making a ward sign with 2 fingers against their own collarbone, less than nothing was apparently a very bad thing to be. "It's fine," she said. To no one in particular, already stepping back into line, already planning the fastest route out of this hall and into air that didn't feel thick with 24 people's held breath. "I'll just relight it." Derek's voice cut across the hall, low and even, but it carried the way an Alpha's voice always carried, cutting through murmurs like a blade through water. The elder blinked at him. "Alpha? Relight the bowl. I want to see it again." Someone produced a flint, and a moment later the fire crackled back to life in the silver bowl, small and orange and entirely ordinary, as if it had never died at all. Derek crossed the hall in 6 strides and stopped in front of Hollie, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. Up close, his eyes weren't flat anymore. They were doing something complicated. Calculation, maybe, or the specific kind of attention people gave to puzzles they suspected they already knew the answer to and didn't like. "Do it again," he said, quieter now, just for her. "Why? So everyone can watch it happen twice?" "Because I need to see it for myself." A pause. "Please." She didn't know why please was the word that made her comply. She held her hand out a second time, over the small, ordinary relit fire, and watched it die again the instant her palm crossed above it, extinguished as cleanly and completely as a held breath let go. The hall erupted into noise this time, voices overlapping. Someone near the front saying the word unmarked like it was an accusation. Another voice saying something about omens that Hollie didn't catch the rest of. She felt suddenly, miserably exposed. 23 women, deep into a ceremony that had never been about her, and now somehow entirely was. Derek didn't look at the crowd. He looked at her, and something settled behind his eyes. Not certainty exactly, but the specific stillness of a man who had just decided something and didn't plan to be argued out of it. "Elders," he said, raising his voice without raising his volume, the way only people born into command ever learn to do. "I'm not finishing the ceremony tonight." The silence that followed was a different kind than the one after the fire had died. This one had teeth in it. Alpha Sullivan, the elder's voice had gone careful, the way people got careful around something they suspected was about to break. "The ceremony determines." "I know what the ceremony determines." Derek's gaze hadn't moved from Hollie's face. "I'm choosing outside it. That has never been done. In 200 years, no Ironvale Alpha has ever. I'm aware of the history, Elder Booth. I'm choosing anyway." He finally turned, taking in the room. Karen Hamilton's stricken face among the others, the elder's open mouth, the general stunned quality of 24 people watching their Alpha set fire to a tradition older than the hall they were standing in. "Hollie Ellis, I'm claiming you as my mate, ceremony or not." She stared up at him, very aware of her own heartbeat, very aware that she had walked into this hall an hour ago, a guest with no stake in anything happening inside it, and was apparently about to walk out as the reason a 200-year-old law had just been broken in front of witnesses. "You don't even know me," she said, because it was true, and because someone needed to say something true, in a room that had just filled up with things that weren't. "No," Derek agreed, "I don't." "Then why?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer at all. When he did, his voice had dropped low enough that it felt like it belonged only to the two of them, even with the whole hall still listening. "Because that fire has surged for 30 women tonight, and meant nothing each time. And it died the instant it touched you, and I have never in my life seen it do that, and I want to know why." His jaw worked once, like he was deciding how much more to say. "That's not a romantic answer, I know that, but it's the honest one." Behind them, Elder Booth had found his voice again, and it was rising. "Alpha, you understand what breaking the right means. You understand the history." I understand there's a story old men tell to keep alphas in line, Derek said, not unkindly, but with finality. I've heard it my whole life. I've never seen proof it's anything more than that. Hollie watched the elder's face do something complicated. Fear, she thought, though it took her a moment to recognize it under the anger. Real fear. The kind that didn't argue louder, just went quiet and watchful instead. Then may the moon witness your choice, Alpha, Elder Booth said finally, very softly. And may it go easier on you than it did on the last one who made it. Nobody explained what that meant. Derek didn't ask. Hollie wanted to, the question was right there, crowding the back of her throat. But the hall was already breaking apart into a dozen urgent, whispered conversations, and Derek's hand had found the small of her back, warm and certain, guiding her toward the doors before she'd fully agreed to be guided anywhere. She went anyway. She told herself it was because there was nowhere else to go. She didn't quite believe herself, even then. Chapter 2. Ironvale's guest quarters had never felt small to Hollie before tonight. Now, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed with her knees pulled up and her cousin's borrowed shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, the room felt like it was holding its breath along with her. You're not actually going through with this. Dorothy stood by the door, arms crossed, the particular posture of a woman who had already lost an argument and was still determined to have it anyway. Hollie, the entire hall went silent. People made warding signs at you. I noticed. That's not an answer. I don't have one yet. Hollie pressed her palms against her eyes until she saw spots. He claimed me in front of the whole pack, Dorothy. I can't exactly unclaim myself by walking back to the guest house and pretending it didn't happen. You can. People do it. Bonds that aren't consummated, that aren't. It's not about whether I can. The words came out sharper than she meant them. It's about the fact that something happened in there that nobody will explain to me. The fire didn't just fail to surge. It went out, twice. And every single person in that hall looked like they'd seen something they'd hoped never to see again. She dropped her hands. I want to know what that was before I decide anything. A knock interrupted whatever Dorothy might have said next. 3 measured knocks, low on the door, the kind that belonged to someone who didn't make a habit of explaining himself before he was let in. Derek. Dorothy's expression went carefully blank, the diplomatic mask of someone who knew exactly whose door this technically was anymore. I'll be next door, she said, and let herself out with a look at Hollie that promised this conversation wasn't finished, only postponed. Derek stepped inside and didn't sit. He stood near the cold hearth instead, arms loose at his sides, looking like a man who had rehearsed several different ways to start this conversation, and discarded all of them somewhere on the walk over. You could have warned me, Hollie said, before he found a new way to circle the point. Before all of that, you could have said something like, there's a chance this goes badly, instead of letting me find out in front of 24 witnesses, and an elder who looked like he wanted to perform an exorcism. I didn't know it would go like that. Derek's voice was even, but there was something underneath it, something careful. I've watched that ceremony every season since I was 12. I have never seen the fire die. Not once. Not for anyone. What does it mean? I don't know. Don't. The word came out harder than she intended. Don't do that. Don't give me the alpha non-answer. You stood in front of your entire pack and broke a 200-year tradition for a woman you'd known for 6 days, based on something you just told me you don't understand. That's not nothing. That's not a shrug. So tell me what you actually think it means, even if you're not certain. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite respect, but adjacent to it. The look of a man recalibrating his estimate of someone upward. He was quiet for a long moment, jaw working, before he answered. There's a story, he said finally, older than anyone living, about the first Ironvale Alpha, Conrad Sullivan, if the histories have the name right, and the brother he betrayed to take the territory. The story says the brother cursed the bloodline before he died, said no Ironvale Alpha would ever be allowed to choose freely again, that the fire itself would choose for them, forever, as punishment, and that any Alpha who tried to defy it would pay a debt the brother never got to collect himself. Hollie felt something cold settle low in her stomach, and the fire dying tonight might mean nothing. Might mean the bowl's old, and the oil inside it was bad. Might mean a draft caught the flame at exactly the wrong moment. Twice. Which I'll admit, sounds unlikely when I say it out loud. He met her eyes. Or it might mean the story isn't just a story, and I just did the one thing every alpha before me was warned never to do. You don't actually believe that. You said yourself it's a story old men tell to keep alphas in line. That's what I've told myself for 20 years. He exhaled, something almost like a humorless laugh. It's easier to believe a thing is superstition, right up until it does something a draft can't explain twice in a row. Hollie wrapped the shawl tighter, suddenly cold in a way that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Then why did you choose me anyway? If there was even a chance that story was real, why not just let the fire pick someone else and walk away clean? Derek was quiet long enough that she thought, again, he wouldn't answer. When he finally did, his voice had dropped, rougher than before, like the admission cost him something to make. Because I watched that fire surge for 30 women tonight, and felt nothing each time. Obligation, calculation, the weight of knowing I'm 31, and unmated, and the council's been muttering about succession for 2 years now. His amber eyes held hers, steady despite the rawness underneath. And then it went out the second your hand crossed it, and for 1 second, Hollie, I felt something that wasn't obligation at all. I felt curious, about a person, not a problem to solve. He shook his head slowly. I don't have a better reason than that. I know it's not enough. I know it might not have been worth what it could cost. But it's the truth, and I'm not going to dress it up as something cleaner than it was. The honesty of it landed somewhere Hollie hadn't expected to be vulnerable. She'd braced for political reasoning, the kind of practical calculation she'd half expected from an alpha who needed an heir and a mate before some council deadline. She hadn't braced for curious, for a man admitting he'd broken his bloodline's oldest law over a feeling he couldn't fully justify. That elder, she said instead, because it was safer ground than whatever was happening in her own chest. Elder Booth. He said something about it going easier on you than it did the last alpha who made this choice. What did he mean? Derek's expression closed slightly. The careful stillness of a man choosing which truths to share and in what order. There's a record. 3 generations back, an alpha named Joseph Sullivan chose outside the fire, same as I did tonight. Within the season, his mate died. Sickness, officially. No warning, no explanation the healers could ever agree on. He held her gaze deliberately. I'm telling you that because you asked me not to give you the alpha non-answer, and because you deserve to decide what happens next with the same information I have, not less. The room went very quiet. Outside, Hollie could hear the low murmur of the pack settling for the night, fires being banked, voices carrying faintly across the stone paths between buildings, an entire community going about an ordinary evening, while she sat here, absorbing the fact that the man across from her had just told her, plainly, that the last time this happened, the chosen woman hadn't survived the season. And you're telling me this, she said slowly, instead of asking me to trust you and stay anyway. I'm telling you because asking you to trust me without telling you everything I know isn't trust. It's just hoping you don't find out. He crossed the room, not touching her, stopping at a careful distance that still somehow felt close. If you want to leave, tonight, tomorrow, whenever, I'll have someone escort you back to your cousin's territory myself, and I won't make it harder than it needs to be. I'm not going to pretend this is a small risk to ask you to take. Hollie looked down at her own hands, at the absence of any ring or mark, at the strange fact that despite everything, the dead fire, the warding signs, the story of a woman 3 generations dead who'd shared this exact moment and hadn't lived to see the next season, she didn't feel the immediate, obvious pull toward the door that she probably should have. What happens if I stay? She asked. And we do nothing. No bond ceremony, no consummation, just proximity. Does the debt still come looking, or does it only matter if the claim becomes real? I don't know. Derek's honesty here, too, was almost startling in its plainness. The histories aren't clear on whether the debt responds to the claim itself or to what comes after. Joseph Sullivan's mate died within the season, regardless of how far the bond had progressed, from what records survived. That's the most honest answer I have. That's not very reassuring. No, he agreed. It isn't. She almost laughed. A strange, brittle impulse, born more of exhaustion than humor. You're not very good at convincing people to stay. I'm not trying to convince you of anything. His voice was quiet, certain. I broke that tradition because something in me wanted to know you. not because I needed you to fix a succession problem. Whatever you decide next, I'd rather you decide it with the truth than with whatever story would make it easier for you to stay." It was, Hollie thought, possibly the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her, and it was deeply unfair that it was coming from a man who'd potentially just put her life on a timer she couldn't see. "I need to think," she said finally. "I'm not deciding anything tonight." "That's fair." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something caught between hope and the deliberate withholding of it. "For what it's worth, Karen Hamilton, the fire surged for her tonight, brighter than I've seen it surge in years. If I'd followed the right the way I was supposed to, she'd be the one sitting where you're sitting right now." "Why are you telling me that?" "Because you should probably ask her, at some point, how she feels about the fire choosing her for a man who didn't want what it offered." His jaw tightened slightly. "I have a feeling her answer might matter more than either of us realizes yet." He left before Hollie could ask what he meant by that, the door clicking shut behind him with a quiet finality that somehow felt louder than if he'd slammed it. She sat alone in the small room for a long time afterward, turning his last words over in her mind, and found that the question wasn't should I stay or should I go anymore. It had quietly become something else entirely. What does Karen Hamilton know that nobody else in that hall was willing to say out loud? Chapter 3. Karen Hamilton lived in a narrow stone house near the edge of the training yards, close enough to the constant clash of practice weapons that Hollie could hear them clearly even before she reached the door. She'd spent the morning asking careful, casual questions of anyone who'd answer them. Dorothy's neighbors, a healer's apprentice restocking salves near the guest quarters, an old man feeding chickens who'd been happy to talk about almost anything except the one subject Hollie actually wanted, and had come away with exactly 2 useful facts. Karen trained with the pack's weapons master most mornings, and Karen had said no to 3 different suitors over the past year, all of them solid matches, all of them sensible choices, for reasons nobody in Ironvale seemed willing to repeat out loud. Hollie knocked before she could talk herself out of it. The woman who opened the door looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, the kind of tired that lived in the shoulders, that came from carrying something heavy for long enough that the weight had become part of the posture. Up close, Karen Hamilton was younger than Hollie had guessed in the ceremonial hall, maybe 25, with pale hair pulled back in a practical braid, and the calloused hands of someone who trained seriously, rather than ornamentally. "I wondered how long it would take you," Karen said, before Hollie had managed a single word. "Come in. I'd rather have this conversation where the whole pack isn't listening through the walls." The inside of the house was sparse, functional, more like a soldier's barracks than a home. A single shelf of books, a worn training dummy in the corner, no decoration beyond a faded cloth hanging that looked old enough to have belonged to someone else first. Karen gestured Hollie toward a wooden chair and took the one across from it herself, folding her hands in her lap with the deliberate stillness of someone bracing for an unpleasant task. "Derek told you to come find me," Karen said. "It wasn't a question. He said I should ask how you felt about the fire choosing you for a man who didn't want what it offered." Hollie kept her voice level. "I'd like to know what that means." Karen's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "It means the fire, and I have a complicated history, Hollie Ellis, and most of it has nothing to do with romance." She studied Hollie for a long moment. "How much has he told you about the curse? The brother, the bloodline debt, an Alpha 3 generations back whose mate died within a season after he chose outside the fire." Hollie hesitated. "He said the histories aren't clear on whether the debt depends on the claim being completed, or whether it's triggered the moment tradition is broken. The histories are wrong, or incomplete, probably both." Karen's hands tightened in her lap. "I've spent 4 years going through every record this pack has. Old ledgers, healers' journals, things tucked away in the archive that nobody's opened in decades because nobody wanted to know what was in them. I didn't do that out of curiosity. I did it because the fire has surged for me at every ceremony since I was 17, every single time, brighter than for anyone else in this pack, and no Alpha has ever chosen me." That landed differently than Hollie expected. "Nobody's chosen you? At all? 8 years?" 8 years, Karen confirmed, flat. "Derek's father chose someone else when I was 17. The visiting Alpha from Crest Hollow turned me down at 19, very politely, citing reasons that didn't hold together if you looked at them closely. Derek himself has had 4 ceremonies pass without choosing me, including last night's, where he chose you instead, while I stood 2 places away with the fire still roaring. She met Hollie's eyes directly. Do you understand what that pattern means? Or do I need to spell it out? They're afraid of you. They're afraid of what choosing me would mean. Karen's voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone brittle. I went looking for the answer myself, eventually, because nobody would give it to me honestly. The brother Conrad Sullivan betrayed, the one who cursed the bloodline before he died. His name was Eli. The records call him the bound brother more often than they use his actual name, like even writing him down plainly made people nervous. She stood, crossed to the single bookshelf, and pulled down a slim, water-stained ledger that looked considerably older than anything else in the room. Eli's line didn't die with him. He had a daughter. The daughter's line continued, generation after generation, mostly forgotten, mostly ordinary, until the fire started surging for one of them again. Hollie felt something cold settle into place. You're descended from him, from Eli. As far as I've been able to trace it, yes. Karen set the ledger down between them, open to a page covered in faded, careful handwriting that wasn't hers. The fire doesn't choose based on romantic compatibility. It never did. It chooses based on bloodline debt. It's trying to pair the Sullivan line back with Eli's line, generation after generation, because that's the only way the original curse can ever actually be satisfied. Marriage. Reconciliation. The 2 bloodlines rejoined the way they were supposed to be before Conrad broke faith with his own brother. She looked up. Every time an Iron Veil Alpha refuses the match the fire offers, refuses someone from Eli's line, the debt doesn't just sit quietly waiting for the next ceremony. It compounds, and eventually it collects payment from whoever the Alpha chose instead. The room felt very small and very cold. Joseph Sullivan's mate, 3 generations back. Wasn't from Eli's line, chose elsewhere entirely, same as Derek did with you. Karen's expression had gone carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that took effort to maintain. She didn't survive the season. I found her name in a healer's journal eventually, listed as a fever death, except the healer's private notes describe symptoms that don't match any fever I've ever heard of. Sudden, specific, like something reached into her and simply stopped what was keeping her alive. Hollie's mouth had gone dry. And you've known this. For years. While Derek's father, and the Crest Hollow Alpha, and Derek himself, all turned you down anyway. I've known it, while watching 4 different men make the same mistake the fire keeps warning them against. Yes. For the first time, real anger surfaced in Karen's voice, sharp underneath the careful control. And I want to be honest with you, Hollie, because you didn't ask for any of this. And you deserve better than half-truths from yet another person in this pack, who'd rather protect themselves than tell you what's actually happening. Part of me is relieved it isn't me sitting where you're sitting. I have spent 8 years being the woman every Alpha is too afraid to choose, and there is no version of that experience that doesn't leave scars. She exhaled slowly, but another part of me, the part that's read every account of what happened to the women who got chosen instead of me, is terrified for you. Because Derek didn't just break tradition for a stranger. He broke it for someone the fire actively rejected, not someone it simply ignored. I don't know what that distinction means yet, in terms of how the debt responds. Nobody does. It's never happened before. The fire didn't ignore me, Hollie said slowly, working through it out loud. It went out. Twice. That's not the same as a flat, indifferent flame. No, Karen agreed. It's not. And I don't have an answer for what that difference means, except that I don't think it's nothing. She closed the old ledger carefully, like it might bruise. I think you should know all of this before you decide whether to stay with him. Not because I want to frighten you out of a choice that isn't mine to make. Because I spent 8 years wishing someone had simply told me the truth instead of deciding for me what I could and couldn't handle. Hollie sat with that for a long moment, the training yard noise outside continuing on. Oblivious, ordinary. While inside this small stone house, an entire hidden history had just rearranged itself around her. Derek said the debt collected its payment from Joseph Sullivan's mate, not from Joseph himself. That's consistent with everything else I've found, yes. The curse punishes the Alpha by taking what he chose instead of what he was owed. Karen's voice had gone very quiet. Which means if the pattern holds, Hollie, it isn't Derek the debt is coming for. The words settled into the small room like a verdict. Hollie became aware, distantly, of her own pulse, of the particular silence that followed an unbearable sentence once it had finally been spoken aloud. How long, she finally asked, before it usually collects? Joseph's mate died within the season. Is there a specific window, or? I don't know precisely. The records aren't that detailed. Karen met her eyes, and for the first time her careful composure cracked just slightly, revealing something almost like sympathy underneath the years of accumulated resentment. But if I were you, I wouldn't assume you have longer than a single turn of the season moon to find out whether there's a way to stop it. Because as far as I've ever been able to determine, in 200 years, nobody's tried. Chapter 4. Derek found her on the path between Karen's house and the guest quarters, which meant either he'd been watching for her, or the pack's gossip moved faster than Hollie had given it credit for. Probably both. You spoke with her, he said. Not a question. You knew I would, that's why you told me to. Hollie kept walking, and he fell into step beside her without being asked. She told me about Eli, about the bloodline debt, about what happened to Joseph Sullivan's mate. She stopped, finally, turning to face him directly. Why didn't you tell me all of that last night? You said you wanted me to have the same information you had. Because I didn't have all of it, not the way she does. Something in his expression tightened. Not defensiveness, exactly, but the particular discomfort of a man confronting the limits of his own knowledge. I knew the surface of the story. The betrayed brother, the curse, Joseph's mate dying within the season. I didn't know about Eli's daughter. I didn't know Karen was descended from him, until she told you, apparently, before she ever told me. You're the Alpha. How does she know more about your own bloodline's curse than you do? Because I spent 20 years being told it was superstition, and she spent 8 years living the consequences of being the proof it wasn't. His jaw worked. I should have asked her directly years ago, instead of letting my father's discomfort with the subject become my own. That's on me, not on her. It was, Hollie thought, a more honest accounting than most men managed even when they weren't standing in the wreckage of a decision that might cost someone their life. It didn't make her less afraid. It made her marginally more willing to keep talking to him instead of walking away. Karen said if the debt collects, it won't come for you. It'll come for whoever you chose instead of the match the fire offered. She watched his face carefully as she said it. That's me. I know. 2 words, flat and final, carrying more weight than a longer sentence could have managed. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, and I'm not going to ask you to pretend you didn't hear it from her. I've already sent word to the council, asking what records exist beyond what Karen found. I want every resource this pack has turned toward understanding what we're actually dealing with. Starting today. That's something. It's not a solution. No, it isn't. He exhaled slowly. But I'd rather spend the next month finding one than spend it pretending the problem doesn't exist. They walked in silence for a stretch, past the training yards where Karen's absence felt suddenly conspicuous to Hollie, now that she knew why the woman trained as hard as she did. 8 years of being the chosen and rejected, channeling whatever that did to a person into something with a weapon in her hand. Derek didn't speak again until they'd reached the edge of the pack house, where a cluster of elders stood waiting with the particular stillness of people who'd been waiting deliberately, not idly. Alpha. Elder Booth stepped forward first, his expression carefully arranged into something between deference and disapproval. If the claim stands, and the council has not yet ruled on whether it does, given the circumstances, there are responsibilities that come with it, responsibilities that fall to her, not just to you. What responsibilities? Hollie asked, before Derek could answer for her. Elder Booth's gaze flicked to her, faint surprise registering it being addressed directly. An Alpha's claimed mate represents Ironvale in matters of trade negotiation, dispute mediation between pack families, and ceremonial duties tied to the turning seasons. These are not symbolic roles. They carry real authority and real consequence if performed poorly. His eyes moved back to Derek. Given that the fire itself rejected her, the council believes it would be unwise to introduce her to these duties gradually. Better to know quickly whether she's capable of holding the position at all. That's not a test, that's a setup, Hollie said flatly. It's tradition, Booth replied. without apparent irony. An Alpha's claimed mate has always been expected to demonstrate fitness for the role swiftly. We are simply declining to make an exception for you. Derek's hand found the small of her back, the same gesture from the ceremonial hall, warm and grounding. She's not doing this alone, Elder. She will be doing the actual duties alone, Alpha, regardless of how much support you offer privately. That is the nature of the role. Booth's expression softened, marginally, into something that might have been genuine concern beneath the procedural coldness. I am not your enemy in this, whatever it might seem. I would simply rather know now whether this claim can survive contact with reality than watch it collapse slowly over months, while the pack's confidence in its Alpha erodes alongside it. There was, Hollie had to admit, an uncomfortable practicality to that logic, even wrapped in language that felt designed to intimidate rather than reassure. What's first, she asked, in terms of duties? 3 trade representatives from the Crest Hollow pack arrive in 4 days, here to negotiate hunting rights along the shared border. Traditionally, the Alpha's mate hosts the welcoming proceedings and sits in on the early negotiations as a witness and advisor. Booth's gaze was steady, assessing. You have no training in Ironvale's trade history, no familiarity with Crest Hollow's negotiating customs, and 4 days to acquire both. I am not telling you this to discourage you. I am telling you because pretending otherwise would serve no one. After Booth withdrew with the other elders, Hollie found herself standing in the open courtyard with Derek, the weight of an impossible deadline settling over her like a second, heavier shawl. I don't know the first thing about trade negotiations, she said. I know. That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be true. Derek's mouth twitched, something almost like the start of a smile that didn't quite arrive. I can teach you Ironvale's side of it. Border histories. What we've traded with Crest Hollow before. What they're likely to push for. I can't teach you how to read a room of strangers who don't want to be read. Or how to know which concession actually costs us something, versus which one just sounds like it does. He paused. That part, you'd have to find in yourself. And I don't know yet whether it's there. It was, Hollie thought, an oddly honest thing to admit. That he had no idea whether she could do this. That he wasn't going to manufacture false confidence to make the next 4 days easier to face. She found she preferred it to comfortable lies, even as some smaller, more frightened part of her wished, briefly, for exactly those lies instead. The 4 days that followed blurred into long hours of memorized border disputes, old treaties, half-understood customs that Derek explained with more patience than she'd expected, from a man carrying his own private fear about what the season's end might bring. She learned that Crest Hollow valued formality above almost everything else, that their negotiators considered direct eye contact during certain ceremonial phrases a sign of respect rather than confrontation, that 3 generations back, Ironvale had nearly gone to war with them over a hunting boundary dispute that had taken a decade to fully heal. She also learned, with mounting dread as the 4th day approached, that she was bad at almost all of it. She mixed up 2 treaty clauses during a practice session with Derek, confusing a grazing right with a water right, in a way that would have, in an actual negotiation, conceded something Ironvale couldn't afford to lose. She froze during a mock formal greeting, the careful phrasing tangling in her mouth, until Derek gently corrected her. Twice, with visibly fading patience he tried and mostly failed to hide. This isn't working, she said, on the evening before the Crest Hollow delegation's arrival, after a 3rd consecutive failed attempt to remember which border marker corresponded to which historical dispute. I'm going to walk into that room and prove every single thing Elder Booth already suspects about me. Maybe, Derek didn't soften it, which she appreciated even as it stung. Or maybe formal negotiation just isn't where your strength sits, and we find that out tomorrow instead of pretending otherwise tonight. He studied her for a long moment. Can I ask you something that has nothing to do with treaties? At this point, I'd welcome it. When you found out about Karen, about the fire surging for her, about her being passed over for 8 years, what did you feel first, before anything else? Before sympathy, before guilt? What was the very first thing? Hollie thought about it honestly, surprised by the question, more surprised by how easily the answer came once she let herself look for it. Anger, she said slowly. Not at her. At everyone who let that happen to her and called it tradition. at the fact that nobody bothered to ask her a single honest question in 8 years, when one conversation might have spared everyone a decade of fear and superstition. She frowned. Why does that matter? Because that's the first time since I've known you that you've answered a question without hesitating to find the careful version first. Something in Derek's expression had shifted, an idea visibly forming behind his eyes. Tomorrow, during the negotiation, when Crestfollow pushes on the border dispute, and they will, because it's the oldest leverage they have against us, don't try to remember the careful, formal phrasing we practiced. Just tell them the truth about what that decade of conflict actually cost both packs. Plainly, the way you just told me about Karen. That's not how negotiations work. It's not how Iron Veil's negotiations have ever worked, Derek agreed. Doesn't mean it's wrong, it might just mean nobody's tried it. Hollie didn't sleep well that night, turning over treaty clauses and formal phrasings she still half feared she'd misremember. But somewhere underneath the anxiety, a different, steadier thought had taken root. That perhaps the test waiting for her tomorrow wasn't actually the one Elder Booth thought he was setting. Chapter 5. The Crest Hollow delegation arrived at midday. 3 riders in dark traveling cloaks who dismounted with the kind of synchronized formality that told Hollie immediately how much store they put in appearances. She recognized the lead negotiator from Derek's description before anyone introduced him. Older, silver at the temples, eyes that catalogued the entire courtyard in a single sweeping glance before settling, briefly and pointedly, on her. Alpha Sullivan. He inclined his head with exactly the correct depth, no more, no less. And this must be the mate we've heard so much about already. Something in the careful neutrality of his tone suggested the things he'd heard hadn't all been complimentary. Hollie Ellis, Derek said, his hand finding the small of her back in the gesture she'd already come to recognize as steadying rather than merely possessive. She'll be sitting in on our discussions. The negotiator's eyes flicked over her with an assessment so thorough it bordered on rude, then settled into something carefully unreadable. Of course, tradition after all. They moved the formal proceedings into Iron Veil's council chamber, a long room with a stone table worn smooth by generations of hands and elbows, and Hollie spent the first hour mostly silent, watching the way the two sides circled each other through careful, formal language that meant considerably more than it said. Derek had been right about the eye contact custom. She watched Cresthollow's negotiator hold Derek's gaze a beat longer than seemed natural during certain phrases, a deliberate signal she'd have entirely missed without his coaching. The border dispute came up exactly when Derek had predicted it would, framed with the kind of wounded formality designed to extract concessions through implied grievance. The northern grazing line has never been resolved to Cresthollow's satisfaction, the negotiator said, his tone carrying the particular weight of an old complaint polished smooth through repeated use. Our grandparents' generation paid heavily for Iron Veil's reluctance to compromise. We would hope this generation might finally show the flexibility theirs did not. Hollie felt the formal response she'd memorized rising automatically, the careful phrasing about historical boundary markers, the precedent from the treaty 3 generations back, all of it technically accurate and entirely beside the point. She watched Derek's jaw tighten slightly, preparing his own version of the same well-worn argument. She spoke before either of them could. "How many of your people actually died in that conflict?" she asked. The room went very still. The negotiator's eyes snapped to her, surprise flickering across his careful composure before he smoothed it away. "I beg your pardon?" "The boundary dispute. 3 generations back. I read the treaty histories this week. They talk about grazing lines and water rights and historical precedent, but none of them actually say how many people died on either side before it was resolved." Hollie kept her voice level, curious rather than confrontational. "I'm asking because I think that number matters more than which marker the original boundary stone was supposed to sit beside, and I haven't seen anyone in this room mention it yet." 17, the negotiator said, after a long pause, something in his formal mask cracking slightly. "On our side. I don't know Iron Veil's count." 11, Derek said quietly, beside her. "I looked it up after this morning's conversation. I didn't know either, until then." 28 people, Hollie said, died over a grazing line that's been peacefully shared without incident for the better part of a decade now. That's not a number either of our packs should be using as leverage in a negotiation. That's a number both packs should be embarrassed we let things reach in the first place. She looked directly at the negotiator. The way Derek had explained Cresthallow read as respectful rather than challenging. I don't know the formal language for what I'm about to say, so I'm going to say it plainly instead. I think we should resolve the current dispute generously, on both sides, specifically because of what the last one cost. Not because tradition demands a particular concession from one side or the other, but because 28 deaths should be worth more to both our packs than winning an argument about which precedent applies. The silence that followed had a different quality than the one before it. Not the held-breath tension of a negotiation moment mishandled, but something more like genuine surprise settling into reconsideration. That is, the negotiator said slowly, not how these conversations typically proceed. I'm aware, Hollie said. I'm new to this. I don't have 20 years of formal precedent built up in my head telling me what I'm supposed to say next. I only have what I actually think, which is that grief should outweigh pride more often than it seems to, in negotiations like this one. Derek hadn't spoken, but Hollie could feel him watching her with an attention that had shifted register entirely. Not the careful coaching of a teacher monitoring a student's progress, but something closer to genuine surprise. The recalibration Karen had described, applied now to her instead of to him. The negotiator exchanged a glance with the two younger delegates flanking him, some silent communication passing between them that Hollie couldn't fully read. When he spoke again, the formal weight in his voice had eased, just slightly, into something more direct. My grandfather was one of the 17, he said. I have spent my entire career in these negotiations carrying that number like a weapon, and I'll admit, no Iron Veil representative has ever once asked me what it actually cost. He inclined his head toward her, the gesture noticeably different from the earlier formal incline, warmer, more genuine. I would be willing to discuss generous terms, Hollie Ellis, on the condition that this approach continues to characterize Iron Veil's negotiating posture going forward. I find I prefer it considerably to the alternative. The rest of the negotiation moved faster than Hollie would have believed possible that morning, old grievances dissolving into practical, generous compromise, once both sides stopped performing the careful theater of formal grievance and started simply naming what they actually wanted and why. By the time the Cresthallow delegation departed 2 hours later, the border dispute had been resolved more favorably for both packs than anyone had managed in 3 generations of careful, formal, utterly stalled negotiation. You weren't supposed to do that, Derek said, once the courtyard had emptied and they were alone again. His tone caught somewhere between disbelief and something that looked, unmistakably, like admiration. I spent 4 days teaching you formal phrasing, and you abandoned almost all of it in the first 10 minutes. I know, I'm sorry, Don't apologize. He shook his head slowly. You did something I've watched 2 generations of trained negotiators fail to do in that exact room. I don't care that it wasn't the version we practiced. His amber eyes held hers, something warm and startled moving behind them. How did you know to ask about the deaths? Nothing in the treaty histories I gave you mentioned casualty counts. I didn't know, Hollie admitted. I keep thinking about Karen. About 8 years of nobody asking her a single honest question because everyone preferred the comfortable, formal version of not dealing with something uncomfortable. I think I just got tired of watching the same pattern happen again, in a different room, with different stakes, and decided to ask the uncomfortable question instead of the careful one. Something shifted in Derek's expression, the recalibration settling into something steadier, more permanent. Elder Booth set this test expecting it to expose a weakness. I don't think he anticipated it exposing a strength nobody in this pack, including me, knew to look for. It's still only one negotiation, Hollie said, though something in her chest had eased, just slightly, at the genuine warmth in his voice. I don't know if I can actually do this. The mediation duties, the ceremonial roles, all of it. Neither do I, Derek said, and there was something almost gentle in the admission. But I'd rather find out by watching you do this. Your way, not the way 200 years of formal precedent insists it should be done, than spend the rest of the season pretending I already know the answer. Word of the negotiations' outcome moved through Iron Veil faster than Hollie expected, and by evening, the careful, suspicious glances that had followed her since the ceremony had shifted into something more complicated. Not full acceptance, not yet, but a grudging, curious reconsideration that felt, For the first time since the fire had died in that silver bowl, like the beginning of an answer to a question she hadn't fully known she was asking. It didn't make the deeper fear go away. Somewhere out there, the season moon was still turning toward whatever deadline Karen's research suggested they were racing against, and a successful negotiation, however unexpected, did nothing to address the actual debt waiting to collect. But for one evening at least, Hollie let herself feel something other than dread, a small, surprising confidence that whatever she was, whatever the fire's rejection actually meant, she wasn't entirely the weakness everyone had assumed she'd be. She should have known better than to let that feeling settle too comfortably. The next morning, a message arrived at the pack house that would make clear just how little time that comfort was ever going to be allowed to last. She wasn't trained for any of this, and she's still finding out what she's capable of. If you want to see whether she's strong enough for what's coming, subscribe now so you don't miss the rest of her story. Chapter 6. The message arrived with a runner from the eastern border, a young pack member, barely past his first shift, breathless from the distance he'd covered at speed. He found Derek and Hollie still in the council chamber, finishing the last of the morning's correspondence from Crest Hollow, and delivered his news with the particular urgency of someone who'd been told the words mattered before he'd fully understood why. Alpha, there's a delegation approaching from Hollow Pine territory. They're asking for you by name, and for... He hesitated, glancing at Hollie with something like apology. They're asking about the woman the fire wouldn't light for. Derek's expression went carefully still in the way Hollie had learned meant he was working hard to keep something else from showing through. Hollow Pine has no standing claim in Ironvale's ceremonies. Who's leading the delegation? They didn't give a name, Alpha. Just said their business was urgent, and that it concerned a debt older than the current Alpha's memory. The phrase landed in the room like a struck bell. Hollie felt Derek's hand find hers under the table, briefly, a gesture so unlike his usual careful composure that it told her more than his expression did. Bring them to the courtyard, Derek said. I'll receive them there. The delegation that arrived an hour later consisted of 2 outriders and a single woman walking between them, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once needed to justify her own presence anywhere. She was older than Hollie by perhaps a decade, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, seen traveling clothes too well made to belong to an ordinary messenger. Alpha Sullivan, she said, before anyone could announce her. My name is Diana Gregory. I represent the Hollow Pine Council, though I suspect that's not actually the introduction you're most interested in. Her gaze moved deliberately to Hollie. You'll be Hollie Ellis then. The fire's rejection. That's a strange way to introduce someone, Hollie said. It's an accurate one, which I find tends to matter more in situations like this. Diana's expression wasn't unkind, exactly, but it carried the particular weight of someone delivering news she'd rehearsed and didn't enjoy delivering. I imagine you've been told by now that the fire's rejection of you was unprecedented, that it's never simply gone out before, for anyone, in 200 years of records. We've been told that, yes, Derek said carefully. Why does Hollow Pine know to ask about it specifically? Because we've been waiting for it. Diana let that settle for a moment before continuing. I should explain properly, rather than in pieces. Hollow Pine has kept its own records of the Sullivan bloodline curse for considerably longer than Ironvale has bothered to. We had reason to. Her eyes moved to Hollie again, something almost gentle entering her expression now. Hollie Ellis, your mother was born in Hollow Pine territory. She left as a young woman, before you were born, and as far as I'm aware she never told you why. The ground seemed to tilt slightly beneath Hollie's feet. My mother died when I was 11. She never talked about where she grew up. I always assumed it didn't matter. It matters considerably more than I think either of you currently understands. Diana reached into the satchel at her side and produced a small, worn book, considerably older than the one Karen had shown Hollie. Its leather cover cracked along every fold. Your mother's lineage traces back through Hollow Pine to a woman named Margit, who left Ironvale territory generations ago, under circumstances the old records describe only as after the betrayal. Margit was Eli Sullivan's daughter, the same Eli your Karen Hamilton is descended from, through a different branch of the same line that never left Ironvale at all. The room went very quiet. Hollie heard Derek's breath catch, just slightly, beside her. You're saying I'm part of Eli's bloodline too, Hollie said slowly, working through the implications even as she spoke them aloud. That the fire didn't just reject me, It recognized you, Diana finished. And it didn't know what to do with that recognition, because as far as any record I've ever found can determine, the ceremony has never once encountered two living descendants of Eli's line in the same generation, eligible for the same alpha, at the same time. She glanced toward the training yards, where Karen's house stood visible in the distance. The fire surged brightest for Karen Hamilton, because her line never left, never diluted, never complicated itself with generations spent outside Ironvale's borders. It went out for you, I suspect, because your blood carries the same debt but arrives wrapped in something the ceremony's old magic genuinely doesn't have a clean answer for. A descendant of the wronged line, returning from outside, choosing, or being chosen by, the very alpha line that wronged her ancestor in the first place. Derek had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the choice he'd made. You said Hollow Pine has been waiting for this. That implies you knew it might happen eventually. We suspected. We didn't know. Diana's expression turned grave. Margot's line carried a warning down through every generation since she left, that if her descendants ever crossed paths with Ironvale's fire again, the old debt wouldn't simply resolve itself quietly. It would demand resolution, one way or another, before the season's end. Margot believed, and every generation after her believed, that the debt was waiting for exactly this. Two branches of Eli's bloodline, present at once, forcing a choice that's been avoided for 200 years specifically because nobody wanted to risk what happens if it's made wrong. What choice? Hollie asked, though some cold, certain part of her already suspected the shape of the answer waiting underneath the question. The curse was never really about punishing alphas for choosing outside the fire, Diana said quietly. That's the simplified version that survived in Ironvale's own records, because it's the version that serves Ironvale's interest. Keep the alphas obedient, keep the bloodline contained, never examine what was actually broken in the first place. The deeper truth, the one Hollow Pine has kept because we had less reason to be comfortable with Ironvale's version of events, is that the debt was always about reconciliation between the two bloodlines specifically, not romance, not marriage for its own sake, an actual, deliberate joining, formal, binding, witnessed, between Conrad's line and Eli's line, to finally undo what the betrayal broke 2 centuries ago. That's what the ceremony was trying to do all along, Derek said slowly. Match an alpha with someone from Eli's bloodline, not because the fire was choosing romantic compatibility, because it was trying to engineer the reconciliation itself, generation after generation, and every time an alpha refused the match it offered. The debt compounded instead of resolving, Diana finished, which means, Alpha Sullivan, you didn't simply make an unprecedented choice when you claimed Hollie, instead of completing the rite with Karen Hamilton standing right beside her. You chose one branch of the wronged bloodline over another, while the ceremony's old magic was still actively trying to determine which branch the resolution was actually owed to. Her gaze moved between them both, weighing something Hollie couldn't fully read. I don't know what happens when a debt this old is asked to resolve itself between 2 competing claims, instead of one clean answer. Nobody alive does, but I don't believe you have until the season's end to find out gently. I believe you have considerably less time than that, and I came here personally to make sure you understood the stakes before they collected payment from someone who never even knew they were part of this story until I arrived to tell them. Hollie became aware, distantly, of her own heartbeat, of Derek's hand still loosely holding hers beneath the table, of the particular vertigo that came from learning her entire life's quiet, unremarkable shape had secretly been moving toward this exact courtyard for longer than she'd been alive to notice. My mother knew, she said softly. She had to have known, at least partially, if Margot's warning came down through every generation. I believe she did, Diana said, not unkindly. I believe she left Hollow Pine specifically hoping to keep her own children far enough from Ironvale's territory that the warning would never become relevant. I'm sorry to tell you it apparently wasn't far enough. Derek finally spoke, his voice rougher than Hollie had heard it since the night the fire first died in that silver bowl. What do you need from us? Why come all this way, beyond delivering a warning we couldn't have acted on regardless? Because Hollow Pine has spent 200 years keeping records Ironvale never bothered to preserve, and because I don't believe this resolves itself through accident or good intentions alone. Diana closed the worn book and held it out, offering it to Hollie directly rather than to Derek. "I believe it requires deliberate ritual correction, performed precisely, by people who actually understand what they're correcting and why. I came to offer Holopine's knowledge toward that effort, because I would very much rather help prevent another death 3 generations from now finding its way into someone else's careless historical footnote." Hollie took the book with hands that weren't quite steady, the weight of it heavier than its physical size should have allowed. Somewhere behind her, she was distantly aware of Derek straightening, of the particular set to his shoulders that meant he was already turning his attention toward whatever came next. Toward Karen, toward the elders, toward the season moon ticking down on a deadline that had just become considerably more complicated than either of them had understood it to be that morning. "Then I think," Derek said quietly, "we need to bring Karen into this conversation immediately. All 3 of us are part of the same broken thread now, whether any of us ask to be. I'd rather face whatever comes next with everyone who actually understands it in the same room, instead of scattered across 3 separate conversations that each only have part of the truth." Diana's expression eased, just slightly, into something that looked almost like relief. "That," she said, "is the first wise decision I've heard an Ironvale Alpha make regarding this curse, in longer than I care to admit." Chapter 7. Corinne's small stone house wasn't built for 4 people, but somehow they fit. Corinne in her usual chair, Diana perched on the edge of the training dummy's base with the worn book open on her knees, Derek standing near the cold hearth with his arms crossed in the posture Hollie had learned meant he was holding himself very deliberately still, and Hollie herself seated across from Karen, close enough that their knees nearly touched. "Say that again," Karen said, her voice carefully, even in a way that suggested enormous effort. "Slowly, because I need to be certain I understood it correctly the first time." "Hollie's mother was born in Hollow Pine," Diana repeated, patient. "Descended from Margaret, Eli Sullivan's daughter, who left Ironvale generations ago, which makes Hollie a descendant of the same wronged bloodline you are, through a different branch that left the territory instead of staying." Karen's gaze moved to Hollie, something complicated moving behind her eyes, not quite hostility, not quite relief, some third thing Hollie didn't have a name for yet. 8 years, she said quietly. 8 years of being the only person the fire ever surged for like that. 8 years of wondering what was wrong with me that no alpha would choose what the ceremony clearly wanted them to choose. And it turns out I wasn't even the only branch of the answer. There was a second one walking around the entire time, just outside Ironvale's borders, that nobody bothered to look for. "Nobody knew to look," Diana said gently. "Hollow Pine kept the warning quiet specifically to protect Margaret's descendants from exactly this kind of attention. I'm not certain anyone acted wrongly here, Karen. I think everyone acted on incomplete information, generation after generation, and the cost of that incompleteness simply kept compounding until it landed on the 3 of us in this room." "That's a very generous way to describe 200 years of nobody asking the right questions," Karen said, but some of the sharp edge had gone out of her voice. She looked at Hollie directly. "I owe you an apology, I think. When you came to my door 3 days ago, some part of me was relieved it was you sitting in that chair and not me. I told you that plainly, because I thought it was the honest thing to say. I didn't know, when I said it, that we were standing closer to the same fate than I realized." "You don't owe me an apology for being honest," Hollie said. "If anything, I think we owe each other the opposite of what's happened so far. No more separate conversations, no more each of us holding a different third of the truth and hoping it's enough." She glanced at the worn book still open on Diana's knees. "What does it actually say? About the correction ritual? How do we fix something that's been broken for 2 centuries? Diana turned several pages carefully, the old paper closer to cloth than parchment in its fragility. "The records are frustratingly indirect, the way ritual instructions from that era often are, written to be understood by people who already knew the underlying tradition, not by people 200 years removed from it, trying to reconstruct the logic from fragments." She found the passage she wanted and angled the book so the others could see, though the handwriting was dense enough that Hollie doubted anyone but Diana could actually parse it easily. "What I can determine is this. The original wrong was a betrayal between brothers, Conrad taking what belonged to Eli, severing a bond that should have remained whole. The correction the ceremony has been quietly engineering for 2 centuries was never meant to be a romantic pairing for its own sake. It was meant to be a formal, witnessed reconciliation between the two bloodlines, performed by an Ironvale Alpha and a descendant of Eli's line, acknowledging the original wrong specifically and explicitly, in front of the pack as witness. "That sounds like something that could be done with either of us," Karen said slowly. "Why would the debt need both branches present at once, rather than simply settling on whichever one the Alpha actually chose?" "I don't know that it does need both," Diana admitted. "I think that's precisely the problem none of us have an answer for yet. The ceremony has never before encountered two living descendants of the same wronged line, eligible at the same moment, with the Alpha already having chosen one over the other, before anyone understood the stakes. I suspect the debt is currently uncertain how to resolve a claim it didn't anticipate having to adjudicate between two valid branches simultaneously. And uncertainty, where old magic like this is concerned, tends to express itself as instability, rather than patience. Which is why the fire died for Hollie, instead of simply staying flat the way it should have for someone outside the bloodline, Derek said, working through it aloud. It wasn't rejecting her. It was registering a conflict it had no precedent for resolving cleanly. "That's my working theory, yes," Diana said. "Though I'll be honest with all three of you. It's a theory built from fragments and inference, not certainty. I don't have a clean diagram of exactly what ritual correction looks like, performed under these specific, unprecedented circumstances. What I have is enough to know that doing nothing, and simply waiting to see what the debt decides on its own, is very likely the most dangerous option available to any of us." The room fell quiet for a long moment, each of them sitting with the particular discomfort of facing a problem that came with no clear instructions and a deadline none of them could verify with certainty. "Then we don't wait for the debt to decide," Hollie said finally. "We bring this in front of the pack ourselves, deliberately, the way the original ritual was supposed to work. Witnessed, formal, explicit about what's being acknowledged and corrected. Not Derek choosing one of us over the other in some private decision the debt has to interpret on its own. All three of us, standing together, acknowledging the actual history out loud, in front of witnesses, and letting the correction happen the way the ceremony originally intended, instead of the broken, partial version 200 years of frightened alphas have left behind." Karen's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're suggesting the three of us perform this together, not Derek choosing between us at all." "I'm suggesting the choice was never actually the point," Hollie said, working it through as she spoke, the shape of the idea clarifying even as she explained it. "The debt isn't about which woman Derek prefers romantically. It's about the wrong between Conrad and Eli finally being acknowledged honestly, by people who actually understand what happened and why it mattered. Maybe the correction doesn't require choosing one branch over the other at all. Maybe it requires both branches being honored, simultaneously, in the same ceremony. Proof that Ironvale finally understands the debt was never really about romance to begin with." Diana was quiet for a long moment, studying the old book as though searching for some confirmation the fragmented text might or might not actually contain. "I can't promise you that's correct," she said finally. "But I will say this. Every failed attempt at resolution I've found evidence of, going back 2 centuries, involved an alpha choosing one woman and excluding the other entirely, whether that exclusion was deliberate or simply accidental, like a fire surging brightly for one candidate, while ignoring whichever others happen to be standing nearby. Nobody has ever tried what you're describing, which means, at minimum, it isn't a path that's already failed before. It also means we'd be the first," Karen said, something wary entering her voice. "No precedent to follow, no guarantee it works at all." "No," Hollie agreed, "but I'd rather be the first people to try something genuinely different than the next people to repeat whatever's already failed for 200 years and hope it goes better this time by accident." Derek finally moved from his place by the hearth, crossing to stand near all three of them, rather than at the room's edge. "If the council needs to formally rule on whether my claim stands before any of this can happen, I'll need to bring this directly to them. All of it. The bloodline connections, the correction theory, everything Diana's brought us." His gaze moved between Hollie and Karen. "I won't pretend this is a simple thing to ask either of you to agree to. Standing in front of the entire pack, acknowledging a debt most of them have spent generations pretending isn't real, with no guarantee the correction actually resolves anything cleanly. I've spent 8 years being talked about by this pack, Without ever being asked what I actually wanted, Karen said. I would genuinely rather stand in front of all of them and say the true thing plainly, even with the risk attached, than spend another season being the quiet, unresolved question everyone whispers about and nobody addresses directly. And I'd rather understand my own family's history honestly, even if the version I'm finding is harder than the comfortable ignorance I grew up with, Hollie added. My mother spent her whole life keeping this from me, hoping silence would be enough protection. I don't think it was. I'd rather try honesty instead, even knowing it might not be enough either. Diana closed the old book gently, something like cautious hope settling into her expression for the first time since she'd arrived. Then I'll help however Hollow Pine's records can, and I'll stay through whatever comes next, because I don't believe any of you should face the council's ruling, or whatever the correction ritual actually requires, without someone present who understands the full history well enough to catch a mistake before it becomes permanent. Derek nodded slowly, the decision visibly settling into something solid behind his eyes. Then we bring this to the council tomorrow, all 4 of us, together, the same way we're proposing the correction itself should happen, witnessed, explicit, nobody carrying a partial truth alone in a separate room anymore. As the evening settled around Karen's small stone house, Hollie found herself thinking, not for the first time since the fire had died in that silver bowl, that the story she'd accidentally walked into had stopped being about whether she belonged in Ironvale at all. It had become something considerably larger. 3 women, 3 branches of the same broken history, deciding together to face a debt none of them had asked to inherit, rather than letting it continue choosing, quietly and separately, which of them it might collect from next. She didn't know yet whether the council would agree to let them try. She didn't know whether the correction, even attempted exactly as she'd proposed, would actually hold against 2 centuries of compounding debt. But for the first time since this had all begun, the fear sitting in her chest had company, something steadier, something that felt, cautiously, like the beginning of an actual plan, instead of simply waiting to see what happened next. Chapter 8. The council chamber felt different in daylight than it had during the negotiation with Crest Hollow. Smaller somehow, despite holding considerably more people. Elder Booth sat at the center of the long table flanking 5 other elders Hollie hadn't met formally, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly wary, as Diana laid the worn Hollow Pine ledger open before them and began, methodically, to walk through everything she'd explained the previous evening. Hollie watched the elders' faces as the history unfolded. Eli's betrayal, Margit's flight, the quiet 2-century thread of warning passed down through Hollow Pine that Ironvale had never bothered to seek out for itself. She watched Elder Booth's expression shift from skepticism toward something heavier, more troubled, as Diana reached the part of the explanation that implicated Ironvale's own incomplete records as much as anyone's deliberate concealment. You're telling us, Booth said slowly, once Diana had finished, that the ceremony itself has been attempting a reconciliation, our own histories never accurately preserved, that 200 years of Alphas avoiding the fire's choice weren't simply being cautious, they were repeatedly failing at something the ritual was actually designed to accomplish. That's my reading of the evidence, yes, Diana said. I understand it's not a comfortable one. Comfort isn't really the council's primary concern at the moment, Diana Gregory. Booth's gaze moved to Derek. Alpha, you knew, when you broke the rite 3 nights ago, that there was a documented precedent of an Alpha's mate dying within the season after a similar choice. You told Hollie Ellis this yourself, by her own account. Did you know, at that time, anything about Eli's daughter, about Margit, about the possibility that the woman standing beside you carried a connection to this curse considerably deeper than simple bad luck with an old ceremonial flame? The question landed in the room with a particular weight, and Hollie felt herself go very still, waiting for an answer she realized, with a small cold shock, she didn't actually know herself. No, Derek said. I didn't know any of that until Diana arrived yesterday morning. But you suspected something, Booth pressed. You said yourself, the night of the ceremony, that you'd never seen the fire behave that way before, that the death itself felt significant, not incidental. Did you choose Hollie Ellis believing there was a genuine possibility you were placing her directly in the path of an old, documented danger, simply because something in you found her? Your word, I believe. Curious? Hollie turned to look at Derek directly. the question suddenly feeling considerably less abstract than it had a moment before. Did you? Derek was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Hollie felt something cold settle into the space between them. A question she realized she'd never actually asked plainly enough to receive an honest answer. I suspected the story might be true, he said finally, his voice low and even, the careful evenness of a man forcing himself through something difficult rather than around it. Not certain. Not the way I am now, with Diana's evidence in front of us. But more than a passing curiosity, yes. I knew Joseph Sullivan's mate had died within a season of a similar choice. I knew the elders' fear in that hall wasn't theater. And I chose you anyway, in that moment, because something in me wanted to, before I'd fully reasoned through what wanting it might cost you. You told me the night you came to my room that you hadn't known it would go that way. Hollie heard her own voice rising slightly, something sharp and unfamiliar moving through her chest. You said you'd never seen the fire die before, like that was new information you were processing alongside me, but you're telling this council now that you already suspected the danger before you ever made the choice. Those are both true, Derek said, not flinching from it. I didn't know the fire would die, that genuinely surprised me. But I knew, before I ever stepped onto that platform, that choosing outside the right carried documented risk. I knew it, and I chose to act on a feeling I couldn't fully justify, instead of stepping back the way every alpha before me had been warned to. His jaw tightened. I told myself, in the moment, that the risk was worth taking, because something about you mattered to me already. After 6 days of barely speaking to each other. I didn't tell you that part as plainly as I should have, because I think some part of me didn't want to examine how reckless that actually was. The room had gone very quiet, the elders watching the exchange with expressions that ranged from discomfort to something almost like vindication, as though this confirmed exactly the recklessness they'd feared from the start. You put my life at risk, Hollie said, the words coming out flatter than she intended. More wounded than angry, based on a feeling. Not on evidence, not on careful reasoning. You knew there was a documented death attached to this exact choice, and you made it anyway, and then you let me believe, that first night, that you were discovering the danger alongside me, instead of having already weighed it before you ever spoke my name in that hall. Yes, Derek said simply. That's an accurate description of what I did, and I don't have a version of it that makes it sound better than it actually was. Hollie felt something complicated move through her. Not quite betrayal, because he hadn't lied to her about the existence of the risk itself, but something adjacent to it, the particular ache of discovering that even careful, mostly honest people sometimes withheld exactly the part of the truth that would have changed how she understood everything that came before it. I need a moment, she said, and stood, and left the council chamber without waiting to see whether anyone followed. She found herself, eventually, at the edge of the training yards, watching from a distance as a pair of young pack members sparred with the kind of careless energy that belonged to people who'd never once had to consider that their own life might be running on a deadline nobody could verify with certainty. You're angry with him, Karen said, appearing beside her without announcement, the same quiet way she seemed to do most things. I don't know what I am, Hollie admitted. Angry, or something underneath the anger that I haven't found the right word for yet. He told me, that first night, that he wanted me to have the same information he had, instead of a comfortable version designed to keep me staying. And then it turns out he'd already weighed the risk to my life against a feeling he couldn't fully explain, and decided the feeling mattered more, before he ever gave me the chance to weigh it myself. That's a reasonable thing to be angry about, Karen said without hesitation. I'd be furious in your position. I think I'd also recognize that it's a very particular kind of furious, not at someone who lied to protect themselves, but at someone who made a choice that genuinely terrified him to make, and then struggled to fully account for how reckless it actually was, even to himself. Does that distinction actually matter? The outcome's the same either way. I'm the one standing at the center of a debt I didn't ask for, because he wanted to know me badly enough to risk it without telling me he already understood the stakes. I don't know if it matters to the outcome, Karen said honestly. I think it might matter to what you decide to do next, though. Whether you're deciding alongside someone who's capable of being honest about his own mistakes, even when the honesty makes him look worse instead of better, or someone who'll keep finding more comfortable versions of the truth every time the real one gets difficult. She paused. For what it's worth, the version of this conversation I just watched him have in that council chamber, admitting it plainly, in front of the elders, without trying to soften it. That's not nothing. Most people, alpha or otherwise, find a gentler story to tell themselves, long before they're forced to say the ugly version out loud, to a room full of witnesses. Hollie considered that for a long moment, watching the two young pack members finish their sparring match, one helping the other up from the dirt with an easy, unthinking camaraderie that felt, suddenly, like something she wanted badly for herself and Derek both. The easy trust that came before any of this had become so complicated. "I need to talk to him," she said finally. "Not to forgive him yet, necessarily. Just to understand the rest of it, the parts he might still be holding back even now, before I decide what comes next." She found Derek exactly where she expected to, in the same courtyard where he'd told her, days ago, that he wasn't trying to convince her of anything. He looked up as she approached, his expression carrying none of the careful composure she'd grown used to, just tired and uncertain, and visibly bracing for whatever she'd come to say. "I'm not finished being angry," she said, before he could speak first. "I want you to know that plainly, instead of pretending I've already worked through it, just because I came looking for you." "I wouldn't expect you to have," Derek said. "I wouldn't trust it if you said otherwise. But I also don't think you lied to me, exactly. I think you told me a true thing on the surface, the night you came to my room, and left out a deeper true thing underneath it, that would have changed how I understood the surface entirely." She met his eyes directly. "I need you to tell me, right now, completely, whether there's anything else underneath that you haven't said yet. Not because I think you're hiding something specific, because I need to know you're capable of giving me everything at once, instead of the version that's easiest to say in the moment, and trusting me to ask the right follow-up question to get the rest." Derek was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice had none of the careful evenness from the council chamber. Just plain, unguarded honesty, the kind that came easier, Hollie was beginning to understand, only after the harder version had already been forced into the open. "There's nothing else," he said. "Everything I knew, everything I suspected, you've heard now, in that room, in front of the elders. I'm not protecting any other piece of this from you." He paused. "But I want to say one more thing, and I need you to hear it as exactly what it is, not as an excuse for what I already admitted was reckless. I would make the same choice again, knowing everything I know now, including the risk to your life. Not because the risk doesn't matter to me, because the alternative, letting that fire choose for me, the way it's chosen for every alpha before me, never once getting to know whether the person standing in front of me actually mattered, feels like its own kind of loss I'm not willing to accept either. I'm not asking you to forgive the way I handled telling you. I'm telling you, honestly, that the choice itself isn't something I regret, even now, even angry with myself for how recklessly I made it." Hollie stood with that for a long moment, the honesty of it landing somewhere complicated, somewhere she didn't yet have a clean answer for. It didn't undo the anger. It didn't erase the particular hurt of learning he'd weighed her life against a feeling, and chosen the feeling first. But it was, she had to admit, exactly the kind of complete, unflinching truth she'd just asked him to give her, offered without any attempt to make himself sound better than the situation actually warranted. "I still need time," she said finally. "I'm not deciding anything about us tonight. But I'm not leaving Ironvale tonight either. I want to see this through, the council's ruling, the correction ritual, whatever comes next with Karen and Diana. That much, at least, I'm certain of." "That's more than I expected you to offer me right now," Derek said quietly. "I'll take it, and I won't push you toward anything more than that until you're ready to offer it yourself." Chapter 9. The council reconvened the following afternoon, and this time the chamber was full. Not just elders and the four of them, but a crowd of pack members pressing into every available space along the walls, drawn by the kind of news that traveled faster than any formal announcement could contain it. Hollie stood between Karen and Diana, with Derek a careful distance away at the head of the room, the physical separation feeling deliberate in a way that hadn't been discussed but that everyone present seemed to understand instinctively. This needed to look like a decision the pack was making collectively, not one their alpha was simply imposing on them from above. Elder Booth rose first, and the room settled into the particular hush that preceded something with real consequence. "The council has spent the night in deliberation," he said. And I'll be honest with all of you. The way honesty seems to have become the standard this entire matter now demands. We are not in full agreement. His gaze swept the gathered elders, several of whom shifted with visible discomfort. 3 of us believe the claim should be voided entirely, that Alpha Sullivan's choice was reckless beyond what this pack should tolerate from its leadership, regardless of the bloodline history Diana Gregory has since uncovered, and that the safest path forward is to return to the original right and let the fire choose properly, without further interference. A murmur moved through the crowd, some of it clearly sympathetic to that position. 2 of us, Booth continued, believe the evidence Diana has presented changes the nature of the question entirely, that this was never simply a matter of an alpha's recklessness, but of a debt the ceremony has been trying, blindly, to resolve for 2 centuries, and that voiding the claim now does nothing to address the actual danger. It simply delays it, and possibly makes it worse, by leaving the debt unresolved with no clear path forward at all. And you, Elder? Derek asked, when Booth paused longer than seemed natural. Where do you stand? Booth's expression carried something Hollie hadn't expected from him, not the rigid formality she'd come to associate with his role, but genuine, weary uncertainty. I have spent 40 years enforcing traditions I largely understood as protective rather than punitive. I believed, sincerely, that the old rite kept this pack safe, from exactly the kind of recklessness your father always warned you against, Alpha. I find myself now uncertain whether the rite was ever actually protecting anyone, or whether it was simply containing a problem none of us understood well enough to solve properly. He looked, for the first time since Hollie had met him, almost apologetic. I don't have a clean answer for you. What I have is this. The council is divided, which means, under Ironvale's own law, the decision falls to demonstrated consensus from those most directly affected by it, not from us alone. Meaning what, precisely? Karen asked. Meaning if the 3 of you, Hollie Ellis, Karen Hamilton, and Alpha Sullivan, can present a unified path forward that you genuinely believe in, witnessed and explained plainly enough for this pack to understand and judge for itself, the council will defer to that consensus, rather than impose our own divided judgment on top of it. Booth's gaze moved across all 3 of them. I will say, for whatever it's worth, that I find myself hoping you can. I am tired of 200 years of this pack managing a danger through avoidance instead of understanding. If there is a better way, I would rather see it tried in my lifetime than leave the problem exactly as broken as I found it. Hollie felt the weight of the entire room's attention settle onto the 3 of them, and beside her, she felt Karen straighten slightly, the particular posture of someone choosing, deliberately, to step forward rather than wait to be asked. Then let us explain it plainly, Karen said, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed chamber, because I think this pack deserves the whole truth, not a summary delivered secondhand by elders arguing about what we already decided privately. She told it methodically, the same explanation Diana had given them, but reshaped now into something meant for an entire pack, rather than 4 people in a small stone house. Eli's betrayal, Margot's flight, 2 branches of the same wronged bloodline, separated for generations, brought back into the same room by accident and inheritance rather than design. The fire's confusion, registering a conflict it had never been built to resolve. The theory that the correction had never required choosing one woman over the other at all, that the debt's real demand was acknowledgement, witnessed and explicit, not a romantic verdict rendered by an old ceremonial flame. When she finished, the chamber held a different kind of silence than before, not the held-breath tension of judgment withheld, but something more like a community absorbing a history it had unknowingly inherited. You're proposing, Booth said slowly, that the 3 of you perform some version of the correction together, not Alpha Sullivan choosing between you. We're proposing, Hollie said, stepping forward to stand beside Karen, that the choice was never actually the point, that 200 years of Alphas treating this like a romantic decision is exactly why it's never been resolved. We'd like to try acknowledging the actual debt honestly instead, formally, in front of this pack as witness, the way Diana's research suggests the original rite was always meant to work before fear simplified it into something narrower and easier to avoid. And if you're wrong? One of the dissenting elders asked, not unkindly. If this experimental correction fails to satisfy whatever the debt actually demands, and the danger collects anyway, What happens then? Then at least it will have collected against an honest attempt instead of 2 more centuries of careful avoidance, Karen said. I've spent 8 years living inside this pack's fear of asking the wrong question. I would rather risk being wrong while actually trying to solve it than spend another generation safely, comfortably uncertain. Diana rose from where she'd been seated near the back wall, the worn hollow pine ledger held carefully in both hands. I'll add one thing, if the council will permit it. Hollow Pine has waited 200 years for someone in Ironvale to take this seriously enough to attempt a real correction instead of simply managing the symptoms generation after generation. I don't know with certainty that what these 3 are proposing will work. I know that every documented alternative has already failed, repeatedly, for 2 centuries. I would rather stand witness to a genuine attempt at something new than watch this pack default once more to the comfortable failure it already knows. Booth was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving slowly across the gathered crowd, reading something in their collective expression that Hollie couldn't fully interpret from where she stood. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the particular weight of a decision made not lightly, but completely. The council defers, he said. Let the correction be attempted, witnessed by this pack in full, at the rise of the next full moon, 3 days from now. If it succeeds, the claim stands fully recognized, debt resolved, and Ironvale's ceremony itself will need to be rewritten to reflect what we've finally understood about its true purpose. He paused, his gaze settling on Derek directly. If it fails, Alpha, you understand what that likely means. For the claim, for this pack's confidence in your judgment going forward, and possibly for the life of whoever the debt ultimately decides it's owed from. I want that risk stated plainly, in front of everyone, so that no one in this chamber can later claim they didn't understand exactly what we agreed to attempt. It's stated plainly, Derek said. I understand it. I'd imagine Hollie and Karen do as well. We do, Hollie said, and beside her, Karen nodded once, firm and certain. The chamber began to empty slowly afterward, pack members filing out in clusters of low, urgent conversation, the weight of what had just been agreed to settling over Ironvale, like a held breath finally released, though not yet resolved. Hollie remained behind with Karen and Deanna as the room cleared, the 3 of them sharing a look that carried more understanding than words could have managed efficiently. 3 days, Karen said finally. That's not very long to prepare for something that's never been attempted before. No, Diana agreed. It isn't. I suggest we use every hour of it as carefully as we can. Derek crossed the emptying chamber to stand near them, his expression carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who'd just watched his own fate, and the fate of 2 women who hadn't asked to be entangled in his bloodline's old wrongs, be placed openly in front of an entire pack's judgment. Thank you, he said, to all 3 of them, for standing in that room and explaining it yourselves, instead of letting me carry it alone, or letting the council simply decide it without your voice in it at all. We didn't do it for you, Karen said, though without real edge to it. We did it because it was finally our turn to be heard plainly, after years of being talked about instead of talked to. If that happens to also help you, Alpha, I suppose that's simply a fortunate overlap. Derek's mouth curved, faint and tired, something that might have been the beginning of real respect settling into permanent shape. I'll take the overlap, he said, and I'll spend these 3 days making sure I deserve it, whatever the correction actually ends up requiring from any of us. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted toward evening, and somewhere above the gathering clouds, the moon that would witness whatever came next was already beginning its slow climb toward fullness, 3 days from a reckoning none of them could fully predict, and considerably less time than any of them would have liked to prepare for it properly. Chapter 10. What the Fire Remembers. The 3 days passed in a blur of preparation that felt, to Hollie, like trying to build a bridge while already standing on it. Diana spent most of her waking hours buried in the worn hollow pine ledger, cross-referencing fragments against whatever older records Ironvale's own archive could still produce, searching for anything that might clarify exactly what the correction ritual needed to contain. Karen trained less and read more. The 2 of them, Karen and Hollie, spending long hours together in the small stone house piecing apart old phrasing, testing theories, building towards something between them that had stopped feeling like wary alliance, and started, quietly, to feel like something closer to friendship. I think I understand the shape of it now, Diana said. On the evening before the full moon, the four of them gathered once more in Karen's home with the ledger open between them. It's not complicated in structure, even if the stakes attached to it are. 3 things, performed in sequence, witnessed by the pack. First, the acknowledgement. Spoken aloud, specifically naming Conrad's betrayal of Eli, not euphemized into an old disagreement, the way Ironvale's own histories have softened it for 2 centuries. Second, an offering from both branches of Eli's line, given freely, to symbolize the wholeness that was broken when Margaret fled, rather than stay and fight for what she was owed. Third, she hesitated. Third, what? Derek asked. Third, the old texts use a phrase I can only translate roughly as, a cost willingly carried, not a wound, not literal blood, as far as I can determine. The histories aren't describing a sacrifice in the sense of harm, but something given up deliberately, by someone with genuine standing to give it, as proof the reconciliation isn't simply words performed for an audience. Diana's expression was careful. I don't know precisely what that needs to be. I suspect it needs to come from Derek specifically, since he represents Conrad's line in this correction, and the original wrong was Conrad's to begin with. What kind of cost? Hollie asked. If it's not blood, not literal harm. I think, Diana said slowly, it needs to be something that costs him real authority. Not symbolic authority. Actual standing, given up freely. The way Eli's standing was taken from him, without his consent, 2 centuries ago. The texts suggest balance matters more than the specific form it takes. Derek had gone very still, the particular stillness Hollie had learned to recognize as a man working through the full weight of something before he spoke it aloud. There's a clause in Ironvale's founding charter, he said finally. I've known about it since I was young, mostly as a historical curiosity, rather than anything I expected to ever invoke. An alpha can voluntarily cede exclusive authority over ceremonial law, not leadership entirely, but specifically the power to interpret and enforce tradition unilaterally, to a standing council elected by the pack rather than appointed by the alpha's own discretion. His jaw tightened. Every Ironvale alpha since Conrad has held that power personally. Giving it up permanently would mean no future alpha in this bloodline could ever again do what I did 3 nights ago. Break tradition by personal decision alone, without the pack's collective voice constraining that choice. That's a significant thing to give up, Karen said carefully. It's the only thing I can think of that actually matches what Diana's describing, Derek said. Conrad took absolute authority over his brother's standing, his claim, his life, without anyone able to constrain that decision. If the correction requires Conrad's line giving something back in equal measure, giving up exactly the kind of unconstrained authority that made the original betrayal possible in the first place, Hollie finished. Not symbolic, permanent, binding every alpha after you, not just you. Yes, Derek said simply. The room sat with that for a long moment, the weight of what he was proposing settling into something Hollie hadn't expected to feel moved by, given everything that had happened between them in the past week. It would have been easier, she thought, for him to offer something smaller, some gesture that cost him discomfort, without actually costing him anything structural. He hadn't done that. He'd found the thing that mattered most to his own bloodline's power, and offered to give it up permanently. For 2 women he'd known less than 2 weeks combined. You don't have to decide that tonight, she said quietly. Sleep on it. Make sure it's actually what you want to offer, not just the first answer that occurred to you under pressure. I don't need to sleep on it, Derek said. I've known, since the moment Diana described what the cost needed to represent, exactly what it had to be. I was simply working up to saying it plainly. His eyes met hers, steady. I broke tradition because I wanted the freedom to choose for myself, instead of letting an old ceremony decide for me. I understand now that the same freedom, left unconstrained in my bloodline going forward, is exactly the kind of power that created this entire 2-century mess to begin with. Giving it up doesn't feel like sacrifice to me, Hollie. It feels like finally closing a door that should have been closed 200 years ago. The full moon rose clear and bright over Ironvale's ceremonial hall. The entire pack gathered once more around the same silver bowl where this had all begun 11 days earlier. The fire burned steady in its center, ordinary and orange, waiting. Hollie stood between Karen and Derek, with Diana positioned slightly apart, the worn ledger held open in her hands as reference rather than script. Elder Booth stood at the head of the gathered council, and beyond them, the entire pack pressed close in a silence that felt, to Hollie, different from every silence that had come before it. Not held-breath dread, but something closer to genuine anticipation. A community finally watching its own history get addressed honestly, instead of managed quietly from a careful distance. "We begin," Diana said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, by naming the wrong plainly, as it actually happened, not as 2 centuries of softened history have preferred to remember it. Derek stepped forward first. 200 years ago, Conrad Sullivan betrayed his brother Eli. He took the Alpha's position that should have passed by right, took the territory, took everything Eli held, and left him with nothing but a curse that's outlived both of them many times over. I am his descendant. I inherited his power without ever inheriting his accountability for how that power was first taken. Tonight, I name that betrayal honestly, in front of this entire pack, instead of letting it remain the comfortable, vague history my bloodline has always preferred. A murmur moved through the crowd, but it settled quickly, the pack listening rather than reacting. Karen spoke next. I am descended from Eli, through the line that stayed in Ironvale, generation after generation, watching the fire surge for me, without ever once being chosen, carrying a debt I didn't fully understand until weeks ago, but feeling its weight regardless. Every single ceremony, every single rejection that I now understand, was never really about me at all. Hollie stepped forward last. I am descended from Eli through Margaret, who fled rather than stay and watch her father's wrong go permanently unaddressed. My family carried this story as silence instead of warning, for generations, until silence simply wasn't enough to keep the debt from finding me anyway. She looked at Karen, then at Derek. I name it now, plainly, alongside both of them, instead of carrying it forward as one more generation of careful avoidance. Diana nodded slowly, and the ritual moved to its second movement, an offering, freely given, from both branches of the wronged line, symbolizing the wholeness that was broken when Margaret fled instead of staying to fight for what she and her father were owed. This part, they had worked out together over the preceding 3 days, not literal objects, but something Diana's research suggested mattered more in spirit than in specific form. Karen reached out first, taking Hollie's hand in both of hers, the gesture deliberate and witnessed by the entire watching pack. I offer you what I should have had all along, Karen said, her voice steady despite the visible effort behind it. Acknowledgement, instead of competition. You are not a rival branch I should resent for arriving late to a debt I carried alone for years. You're the other half of the same wrong, and I would rather stand beside you than continue measuring my worth against whether the fire ever surged for you the way it surged for me. And I offer you the same, Hollie said, her own voice thick with something she hadn't expected to feel this deeply until the moment actually arrived. My family ran from this. Yours stayed and bore the weight of staying. That's not a debt I can repay simply by showing up 2 centuries later and asking you to forgive the running. But I can offer you this. Whatever happens after tonight, you won't carry this alone anymore, the way you have for 8 years. Not because the curse demands it, because I want to choose it, freely, the same way Derek chose to break tradition for reasons he couldn't fully explain at the time. The fire in the silver bowl, Hollie noticed distantly, had begun to shift, not surging, not dying, but burning with a steadiness that felt different from its ordinary indifferent flicker, as though it were listening as closely as the watching pack. Diana's voice carried the final movement of the ritual into the hushed hall, a cost willingly carried, offered by the line that took, in proportion to what was originally taken without consent. Derek turned to face the gathered council and the pack beyond them, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was about to say aloud, permanently, in front of every witness Ironvale could gather. I cede, permanently and without future reclamation, the Alpha's unilateral authority to interpret and enforce ceremonial tradition. From this night forward, that authority belongs to a standing council, elected by this pack's collective voice, not appointed by any Alpha's personal discretion. No future Ironvale Alpha, myself included, will hold the power to break tradition by decision alone, the way Conrad once held the power to break his own brother's claim, without anyone able to constrain him. He paused, his gaze briefly finding Hollie's. I offer this not as punishment for what I did 11 nights ago, which I still don't fully regret, but as proof that this bloodline finally understands what unconstrained power costs the people standing closest to it. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, in the silver bowl at the center of the hall, the fire surged, not toward any single person, not in the old, narrow way it had surged for Karen alone at every previous ceremony, but upward and outward, bright enough that the entire hall seemed to brighten with it, before settling, gently, into something steadier than Hollie had ever seen it burn. Elder Booth made a small, involuntary sound, something between a gasp and a release of breath held far too long. "It's never done that," he said quietly. "In any record I've ever read. Surged like that, for no single hand above it, settling afterward into something that looks almost like peace." Diana finished, her voice carrying real wonder now, the careful scholarly composure she'd maintained for days, finally giving way to something more openly moved. "I believe that's exactly what it looks like, Elder. 200 years of an unresolved debt, finally settling." The celebration that followed lasted long into the night, though it carried a different texture than any Hollie imagined Ironvale's usual gatherings held. Less raucous triumph, more the quiet, settling relief of a community releasing a fear it had carried so long it had nearly forgotten the fear was optional. Karen moved through the crowd with an ease Hollie hadn't seen in her before, accepting congratulations and acknowledgement from pack members who'd spent 8 years treating her presence as something faintly ominous rather than simply unlucky. Diana had already begun discussing, with 2 of the more curious elders, the possibility of a formal exchange of records between Hollow Pine and Ironvale, so that no future generation would have to rediscover any part of this history through accident and crisis, the way the 3 of them had. Hollie found Derek near the edge of the gathering, slightly apart from the celebration, watching it with an expression that mixed genuine relief with something more complicated underneath. "You actually did it," she said, coming to stand beside him, "gave up the thing that mattered most." "I meant every word of it." He looked at her, something searching in his expression. "I know that doesn't automatically resolve what happened between us. The anger, the way I told you a half-truth that first night. I'm not asking tonight's outcome to erase that." "It doesn't erase it," Hollie agreed, "but it tells me something I needed to know before I could decide what comes next. You're capable of giving up something real, instead of just sounding honest while protecting what actually matters to you." She studied him for a long moment. "I'm still not deciding anything tonight. I want you to understand that plainly, the way you've taught me to want plain things instead of comfortable ones." "I understand," Derek said. "Whatever time you need, I'll give it. I'd rather have you choose this. Choose me, slowly and completely, than rush you toward something that repeats the exact mistake I made with the fire 11 nights ago, deciding before I'd actually let myself understand what the decision required." Hollie found, standing there in the settling warmth of a hall that had just witnessed something genuinely unprecedented, that she believed him, not blindly. She doubted she'd ever again extend that particular kind of unguarded trust without holding some careful piece of herself in reserve, but enough to know that whatever came next between them, it would be built on something considerably more honest than the ground they'd started on. "Ask me again," she said quietly, "in a season, when the immediate danger isn't sitting on top of every other feeling, making everything harder to read clearly. Ask me when it's just an ordinary question, instead of one tangled up with curses and debts, and entire packs watching to see what we decide." "I will," Derek said, "and whatever you answer then, I'll trust it more than I'd trust anything either of us might decide tonight." Epilogue: The New Fire. 6 weeks later, Ironvale's ceremonial hall had been quietly transformed. The old silver bowl remained, but a second, smaller flame now burned beside it permanently. A standing reminder, the newly elected ceremonial council had decided that tradition without honest accountability was exactly the failure that had cost this pack 2 centuries of avoidable fear. Karen sat on that council now, the first time in Ironvale's history that a woman descended from Eli's line had held any formal authority over the very tradition that had once determined her worth, without ever asking her a single honest question. Hollie had stayed through all 6 weeks, watching Ironvale slowly reshape itself around a truth it had finally stopped avoiding. She'd watched Derek govern under the council's new constraint with something that looked, increasingly, like relief rather than resentment. The particular ease of a man who'd been carrying unconstrained power, He'd never actually wanted as heavily as everyone assumed he wanted it. She found him, on the evening of the 6th week, in the same courtyard where this had all genuinely begun. Not the ceremonial hall, but the quiet space afterward, where he'd first told her he wasn't trying to convince her of anything. "A season hasn't passed yet," she said. "No," he agreed, "it hasn't. I'm not asking you to ask me again tonight. I'm telling you something else first." She took a steady breath. "I've spent 6 weeks watching you give up the thing that mattered most to your bloodline's power, and keep showing up afterward without resentment, without quietly trying to claim some of it back through smaller, less visible means. I've watched you with Karen, with the council, with this entire pack, and I haven't once seen you revert to the man who made a reckless choice and then struggled to fully account for it." She met his eyes. "I think I already know my answer. I just wanted to give it to you honestly, the way you taught me honesty mattered, instead of waiting for the season simply because that's what I said I needed at the time." Derek's expression shifted, something cautious and hopeful moving behind the amber. "And the answer?" "Yes," Hollie said simply. "Not because the fire chose us, and not because some old debt required it. Because I've watched who you actually are, underneath the choice that started all of this, and I want to choose that person freely, the same way you chose me before either of us understood what it would cost." The kiss that followed carried none of the desperate uncertainty of their first weeks together, just something steady, deliberate, chosen with full knowledge instead of curiosity reaching blindly toward an unknown answer. Word of their formal bonding spread through Ironvale within days, and this time, when the pack gathered to witness it, there was no silver bowl, no ceremonial fire required to confirm what both of them had already decided for themselves. Karen stood as witness beside Diana, who had taken up permanent residence between Hollow Pine and Ironvale, finally able to ensure that no future generation would inherit this history through crisis instead of honest preparation. Ironvale's old fire still burned in its silver bowl, steady and unremarkable now, asking nothing of anyone it touched. The debt was settled, the bloodline, finally whole, and the woman the fire had once rejected entirely became, in the end, the reason it finally learned how to simply burn in peace. Hollie went from unchosen to unforgettable, and her story isn't the only one waiting to be told. Subscribe now and let the next one find you.